It had never occurred to me to go back to Pilate and say, nice try, but I like that one. I like that one a lot. Take that. I'm going to be reading to you, as Amanda said, this is a story set on the day of resurrection. And while last Sunday we talked about how Jesus talked about, at least in Mark's gospel, go on to Galilee and I will meet you there. He still had some work to do locally, I guess, in the Jerusalem area and on the way out of town just toward this small village called Emmaus. So this is the story most commonly known as the walk to Emmaus. From Luke chapter 24, starting in verse 13. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. And while they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other as you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things took place. Moreover, some women from our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning. And when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them all the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near a village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on, but they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was walking with us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour, they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed and has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Well, it was a busy week here on Holy Week. Lots of things going, lots of little details, wanting to make sure that all of everything for the arrangements for Good Friday were taken care of. Did we have enough candles to put out? Did we have enough lighters to light the candles? Easter Sunday, was everything just like we wanted it? And were we ready for all the events of Easter Sunday? And just to make things a little bit more exciting, the painters called and said, "Hey, we have a free week to paint your hallways. How about this week?" And I said, "Holy Week, perfect." And so we did it because it was exciting to think that everything could be painted and ready to go for Easter Sunday morning. I mean, how lovely to have a fresh coat of paint on everything. Now, I want you to be honest with me. Show of hands, how many people noticed? A third. Okay, a third of you noticed that we painted every single surface in this building last week. All right, now, in fairness, there's a lot going on Easter Sunday. And we had donuts and, it was a big thing. Last fall, right before Christmas, we painted this room. That was an even bigger ordeal. That time, scaffolding was set up. That time, This is a square room, and there are more nooks and crannies here for painting than you might realize. It took them the whole week to do that, a team of about 6 painters. And even when I pointed it out, people said, I think it looks the same. And to be clear, you're wrong. It is different. It is lighter, and I can show you before and afters. If you want to know what everything looked like, the answer was khaki. And today it is clay. I like it. I like it, and for the record, you love it, okay? But it was fascinating to see how many people didn't even notice, right? Fascinating. All throughout Lent, there were lots of little things that we threw into the worship service that I'm wondering if you picked up on. Did you notice that we sang the same song to start Ash Wednesday as we started on Easter Sunday morning? I bet very few of you picked up on that, right? For those of you who were here Ash Wednesday, we showed a video of an Easter lily that slowly decayed and died and closed up and kind of fell over on Ash Wednesday. And that was the plan, and it only occurred to me afterwards, like, we should play that in reverse for Easter Sunday. So last week, we played that video in reverse. I don't know how many of you picked up on that. Did you notice that we moved the cross down onto the floor as we moved deeper into the season of Lent, because we were talking about the witnesses at the cross and we wanted all the chairs to be in as though you were witnesses at the cross? Or did you just think, they switched up the chairs, right? So little thing, just wondering if you picked up on that. There was a candle, this candle, that was lit on every Sunday in the exact same spot during the season of Lent, and on Good Friday, that candle was the last candle lit, and that candle went out. And we have a remote control for it, which is how we did it. And I don't want you to think that we were manipulating you, but we did want to make that candle go out by itself last. And so I don't know how many of you noticed that. Some of you were like, whoa, and others, you're like, there was a candle? So, I bring all of these things to your attention for this reason. Every time I read this story about these 2 men on their walk to Emmaus, it is a real head-scratcher for me how they spend the whole day walking with Jesus. We think that Emmaus might have been about 7 miles from Jerusalem. 7-mile walk, and they didn't pick up on the fact that it was Jesus who walked with them. What is that about? Now, I know that there are some people who are maybe more observant, maybe people who call themselves noticers. I am married to someone who is proudly, not proudly, but she will say, I am not a noticer. Like today, she was like, you haven't shaved. It's like, yeah, for a week. And also, if you did notice, I know, it looks terrible. It's in progress. We'll see about next week. But I am married to someone who is not a noticer. And I think of myself kind of as a noticer. And so sometimes I want her to pick up on things, and she doesn't. Like, when did you get a haircut, Tyler? It's like 4 weeks ago. Things like that. But then I'll notice little things. She said, how did you, because I don't know, I guess, because I did. And so there are things that we notice or we don't. And there are times that, based on whatever else is going on in our lives, we may be perceptive on them, or they may just be things that we failed to notice because of the circumstances. So, last Sunday, I don't blame anybody for not knowing that we painted the walls. We had a flower cross with photos. We had lots of people running around. We had twice as many donuts than we usually get. You were coming in sometimes at a different worship time. Like, I don't blame you for not picking up on the walls. And I am looking at this story and thinking, well, let's just talk about the circumstances, shall we? First of all, Luke tells us that Cleopas and this other guy, they are not able to see. Their vision is somehow, they're kept from being able to recognize it's Jesus. But there's a part of me that also says, well, take into consideration all that's going on. These 2 are not necessarily listed as among the 12 disciples, but they are certainly in this larger entourage that has been following Jesus. Even if they haven't been physically following him, they've been sort of tracking what's been going on, the progress in the story, what's been going on in this guy's life. He's created quite a stir. We're interested. We want to know more. And they are clearly distraught by what has taken place. They're walking with their heads down. Jesus comes up to them, "What are you talking about?" And they're like, "How do you not talk about the most obvious thing that's going on?" Jesus says, "Tell me more." So they tell him. "And how have you not heard about this? 3 days ago, the most awful thing we've ever seen took place right before our eyes. And then now we're super confused because these men from our group, and before them, women who went to the tomb and reported that the tomb is empty, and is he alive? These angels were there. Has his body been stolen?" And they're pretty wrapped up in all of their emotions. And it reminds me, and I've shared this before at funerals, but it reminds me that oftentimes this is how grief takes shape, where we are so in the depths of our grief and in those emotions that we fail to recognize what's going on around us. And no finger pointing, I mean, that's just how it is. But how often is that the case when we fail to realize that Jesus is walking with us in those moments and we fail to notice it? So these two men in the depths of their grief, walking along the road, don't understand that it's Jesus who walks with them. Jesus is explaining. He calls them foolish, which seems a little harsh, but maybe he's like, you still don't get it. But they're not picking up on it. They're not noticers. And the story goes on, and they finally get to this village of Emmaus. Were they stopping there at an inn? Did one of them live there? We don't know exactly, but they go into this home or somewhere to rest for the night. Jesus is about to go on. They say, "No, stay with us. Gather with us in this house for the night, and we'll continue our journey tomorrow." And Jesus takes on role of the host, takes the bread, blesses it, breaks the bread, gives it to them, and the light bulb goes off. They notice now. They get it. Now, on the one hand, there's a part of this that's like, oh, well, it's a deja vu moment. I mean, this thing that whether these two guys were present at the Last Supper or whether they just heard about it, or maybe even they were at the feeding of the 5,000, we don't know. But for some reason, something triggers them that when they hear Jesus bless the bread, break the bread, and offer it to them, that's the moment. Wait a minute. And that's also the point in the story where Jesus departs, vanishes, whatever the details are, he's gone. And that's when they go back and they said, whoa, it all makes sense now. I go back and I put all the pieces in place. Wasn't he telling us about this? Yes, this is the fruition of all of these things that he has been talking about, and now it has come to pass, and we were in his presence just now. And so I do think that there's that aha. I do think there's that deja vu moment. I do think that that's when things clicked. But I also think there's something maybe equally significant in this story that we should be attuned to. And that is, how often are we likely to not notice or to overlook Jesus' presence with us, often in the most simple of acts, in the most common of circumstances? How many of us start each day by thinking, this day is a gift. This breath that I draw into my lungs is a gift from God. God's presence is with me. The Spirit, the Ruach of God is with me as I take my breath each morning. How many of us put our heads on our pillows at night in a similar fashion and thank God for what has been in that day and the fact that we are able to bed down in the safety of our homes? How many of us, when we sit around tables with our loved ones, with our neighbors, with our friends, stop and pause to think, in these moments, Jesus is present with us. Jesus is made known in the breaking of the bread. And of course, this story feels so appropriate because it is the story that takes place on Easter Sunday. I mean, this is a story that follows the resurrection story. Later in that day, these two men are on this walk to Emmaus. And that's where Jesus shows up, and they become most aware of his presence when he sits down to share a meal with him. But it also seemed appropriate that on a day when we come together and we gather around tables, and we will be breaking bread shortly, I promise, that I want you to be keenly aware of God's presence in the room, not just as we worship, but as we gather around the tables for fellowship and for sharing a meal together. You know, I've shared this with several of you, and we talked about this a little bit on the church council. But originally, when we sort of pitched this idea as a staff, and then Andrew put out the worship survey that most of you responded to, and you said overwhelmingly that this was something that you were in favor of doing, was combining our two worship services. It was very heartening to me because I've always seen churches that have multiple worship services operate as two or more congregations within a single congregation. I mean, it's inevitable that just becomes a part of what happens. You fall into your rut. This is the service I attend, so these are the people I see most often, or this is the service, and so forth. And there's overlap, maybe with small groups, and there's overlap in passing in the hallways or meeting around a cup of coffee, and all that's fine, and it's inevitable. But it's an exciting and a beautiful thing to think about these two groups who are coming together now as one. We are one body. And together we are going to continue to facilitate that growth, that fellowship, that collegiality, that joy of what comes together when the body of Christ gathers together, not just for worship, but for the breaking of bread. And so as we go back to the tables in just a little bit, I hope that you will sit down at a table, maybe with some familiar faces, but also purposefully, very intentionally, with some unfamiliar faces, because this is your church family. And worship service times make that more challenging. The pandemic has made that more challenging. As people have been away or come back, and travel schedules and all that, it makes things very complicated and difficult. But I know that some of the greatest joy that I have experienced is when there has been a crossover, like the couples retreat or service days or mission projects and things like that, where the whole body comes together for this time of togetherness, of service, of love, of fellowship. And I'm excited about that. And what I want you to be aware of today is that not just in worship, but as we gather around the table, as we break bread or maybe break casserole, I want you to recognize Jesus' presence with you. I want you to remember that Christ walks with us in the grief, in the joy, and in the mundane. And just because we don't recognize Jesus' presence at all moment does not mean that he is not there. It just means that maybe we need to be better noticers. So let's put our antennas up. Let's be looking for Christ among us this week. And let us continue to invite him not just from this time of worshiping with us, but to our table, to our conversation, to our acts of service, to the love that we share with our neighbors, and as we continue to carry out our mission of strengthening families by making and growing highly committed disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. And sometimes that begins with an act as profound as resurrection, or as simple, mundane, and daily as breaking of the bread. Will you pray with me?